He didn't knock. He didn't wait for permission. Tom Cruise just opened the door and stood there, motionless. Across the dimly lit room, Ibrahim Traoré looked up slowly, as if he'd been expecting him for hours or maybe years. But he said nothing, and neither did Tom. For nearly a minute, the silence between them felt louder than war drums. Tom had flown across the world. No press, no entourage, no film crew, just a black duffel bag. And a question he hadn't asked out loud yet. A soldier in the hallway had tried to stop him, but Tom's eyes, bloodshot, burning, made the guard freeze in place. He looked like a man who'd slept next to a loaded gun for days, and maybe he had. Finally, Traoré broke the silence, calm, barely above a whisper. "You found the letter, didn't you?" Tom's hands clenched. His jaw tightened, but he didn't answer. He just pulled something from his jacket pocket, a crumpled, water-stained envelope. The corner was torn. The writing had faded, but one name was still visible: Ibrahim Traoré. Traoré nodded slowly. "It was never meant for you." Tom walked in, closed the door behind him, and locked it. Then he sat down, not like a celebrity, not like a guest, but like a man who had nowhere else to go. And he said only one thing: "Tell me the truth, all of it, or I'm not leaving." 2 nights earlier, inside a private estate in the English countryside, a fireplace crackled gently in the background. Tom Cruise sat alone, swirling a glass of untouched whiskey. His eyes were locked on an old VHS tape, unmarked, except for a tiny label that read Operation Mirrorfall Classified. He hadn't meant to find it. He wasn't even looking. The box had belonged to someone he hadn't seen in over 25 years. Commander David Sloan, an ex-Navy SEAL, a ghost from Tom's past, and the man who had trained him for one of his earliest military roles in Bourne on the 4th of July. Sloan was more than a consultant. He was like a second father, until he vanished. But just days before his death, Sloan had left a package with Tom's name on it. No note, no explanation. Just the tape and that letter. Tom had watched the tape in full silence, and when it ended, he didn't speak for hours. He just stared at the fire like it might swallow him whole. Back in the room with Traoré, the air was thick. Still, Tom leaned forward, his voice low but firm. "You were there, weren't you?" Keitel, 1993. Traoré exhaled. "I was 17. And Sloan?" Tom asked. Traoré nodded once. "He wasn't supposed to be there. None of you were." Tom's voice cracked. "He saved you." Traoré looked him in the eye for the first time. "No, I saved him." Silence again. Tom's grip on the letter tightened. That wasn't what the tape showed. Not exactly. But that wasn't the part that broke him. It was the audio, the few minutes of radio chatter from that abandoned outpost in Mali. Soldiers screaming. Explosions. Then, the voice. Sloan's voice. "I've got the boy. He's not a threat. He's something else. He's looking at me like he sees through me." Then, static. Gunfire. And finally, just before the tape cut off, "Tell Tom I was wrong. About everything." Tom wiped his face with both hands, his voice softer now. "Why did he mention me?" Traore stood up, walked slowly to the window, and looked out into the Birkenhead night. The stars were sharp and clear, like they were watching, judging. "He trained you, didn't he?" Traore said without turning around. "Taught you how to look like a soldier, how to walk like one, talk like one. But he never told you what it costs." Tom looked down. He knew what Traore was doing. not dodging the question building. The moment, he could feel it. Like a fuse being lit, Traore turned back, his face unreadable. Sloan believed in control. Precision. Dominance. That's what your film showed: 2 clean victories, noble sacrifices. Then he walked closer, voice tightening. But what we lived, what I saw at 17, was chaos, blood, abandonment. Sloan saw me in that desert and called me a mistake. Sighed I shouldn't exist. Tom's eyes welled up. And why save him? A beat. A long one. Because he dropped his weapon and cried. And just like that, something inside Tom shifted. It wasn't a story. It wasn't a film. It was a memory that didn't belong to him. And now it lived inside him forever. Traore walked back to the table, sat down again. He slid the crumpled letter back to Tom. I never wrote that for him to give you. But maybe he knew you'd understand it better than he ever could. Tom stared at it for a long time, then opened it again. This time, he read the words out loud. To the man who pretended to be a hero, meet the one who never had a choice. His voice broke. The letter fell from his hand, and he whispered, almost to himself, I think I'm ready to know what really happened. Traore leaned forward and began. I was 17, Traore began, his voice steady like a man who had told this story to himself 1,000 times, but never out loud. There was a drought that year. Crops died. Wells turned to dust. And then the men with guns came. He didn't blink, didn't flinch. They didn't ask. They didn't threaten. They took, one village at a time. Tom leaned in, his elbows resting on his knees, completely still. Traore continued, his gaze somewhere far beyond the walls of that room. One night, I heard my mother scream. I ran. I saw 2 men American deer, but no flags. They were dragging my cousin into a truck. I grabbed the blade from the firewood stack and ran at them. He paused. Tom's breath hitched, but he didn't speak. One of them hit me in the face with the butt of his rifle. I still have the scar. But the other man, he hesitated. That was Sloan. Traore glanced at Tom, just briefly. He didn't shoot. He ordered the others to stop. And for 5 seconds I thought, maybe he was different. But then his jaw tightened. Then he said something I'll never forget. He's just a tribal kid. Get what we came for. Tom's heart was pounding now. He didn't know why. Maybe because a piece of Sloan, his teacher, his role model, was dying with every word. Traore leaned back slowly. They were looking for something. Some tech they believed rebels had buried in the hills. They had no idea it was already gone, already sold. And you? Tom asked quietly. I followed them. Not because I was brave, because I was angry. I wanted to see where monsters slept. Traore smiled faintly. But it wasn't joy. It was a wound. They set up a temporary post at the edge of Keitel. By the 3rd night, something went wrong. Someone sold them out. Dozens of fighters surrounded their camp, but I was already inside. Tom's brow furrowed. Why? To steal a radio, Traore said bluntly. To call the only UN patrol in the region. I thought maybe, just maybe, someone would listen. Tom whispered, You saved them. Traore shook his head. Not all of them. Just Sloan. He was the only one who stayed to cover the others. Everyone else ran. He looked down. He got shot. Twice. I dragged him into a cave. Used an old rag to stop the bleeding. And while he faded in and out of consciousness, he told me about you. Tom froze. He said, There's this kid I'm training. Thinks acting can change the world. Maybe he's right. I hope he's right. Traore looked directly into Tom's eyes now. I didn't know who you were. Not then. Just a name. Tom swallowed hard, trying to steady his voice. And the letter? He dictated it. To me the night he thought he was going to die, Traore said. Asked me to write it in my own hand and give it to you if I ever saw you again. Tom looked down at the torn paper again. The handwriting. It wasn't Sloane's. It was a boy's. The room fell quiet again. But it wasn't the silence of tension. It was the silence of understanding. Tom ran his hand through his hair, his voice trembling. I grew up pretending to be men like him. Strong, certain, untouchable. But he wasn't any of those things, was he? No, Traore replied. He was human, and in the end, he wanted redemption. Tom looked up. And you? What did you want? Traore leaned forward, his voice lower now. I wanted someone to understand that strength doesn't come from guns, or fame, or fear. It comes from survival, from seeing everything crumble and still standing. Tom nodded slowly. Then you and I have both been pretending. There was a long pause. Tom stood up, walked to the window. The moonlight hit his face gently, revealing years of fatigue beneath the polished skin. I came here thinking I needed answers, he said. But I think I needed to listen. Traore stood too. He reached into his desk drawer and pulled out a small, dusty box. He handed it to Tom. Inside was Sloane's dog tag, blackened from smoke, bent from impact, but still whole. He dropped it the moment he passed out. I've kept it all these years, Traore said. Tom stared at it, then closed the box gently. I thought I was here to finish a story, he whispered. But maybe I'm here to begin one. Traore looked at him quietly for a moment, then said, The West sees you as a movie star. I see you. As a man still searching. Tom nodded. Then, after a long breath, he walked toward the door. He paused his hand on the handle, then turned. There's something I didn't tell you, he said. Traore raised an eyebrow. I didn't just come because of the letter, Tom said. I came because I saw footage of you at the orphanage, kneeling in the dirt, crying with a child who had just lost his family. Tom looked away for a second, his voice raw. I've cried in a dozen films, but that broke me. Traore didn't smile. He didn't need to. He just said, then maybe you're ready for the next truth. Tom's breath caught in his throat. He wasn't sure if he wanted to hear it, but his legs moved before his mind could stop them. He walked back toward the table and sat again, the dog tag box still cradled in his hands. Traore reached into a drawer behind him slowly, carefully, and pulled out a worn black notebook. The leather binding was cracked, the corners curled. Dozens of pages were loose inside. He placed it on the table, between them. What is it? Tom asked. Traore tapped the cover. This belonged to Sloane. I found it in his vest pocket while dragging him out of that camp. He never asked for it back. Tom opened it. The pages were filled with sharp, precise handwriting dates, maps, coded symbols, even sketches of faces. But something stood out. Page after page, one name kept appearing. Opal. Who's Opal? Tom asked, frowning. Traore leaned in. Not who. What? He continued, his voice grave. Opal was the name of a covert program. U.S. Special Operations, hidden even from most of their own operatives. It was built on one idea: eliminate rising threats before they become enemies. Tom's eyes widened. You mean kill people based on potential? Traore nodded once. Children, Teenagers, activists, anyone who showed early signs of resistance, leadership, or strategic thinking, especially in regions the West wanted control over. Tom's hand trembled over the notebook. "Are you telling me Sloan was part of that?" Traore answered without emotion. He was one of the founders. Tom leaned back, stunned. The room felt colder now. Traore continued softly. But something changed in him. I don't know if it was the guilt, or seeing what war really does to a child. But after Keitel, he disappeared, went rogue. Maybe he wanted redemption before he died. Tom closed the notebook slowly. His voice barely audible. "And you? Were you on that list?" Traore's eyes didn't blink. "I was number 9. Silence again. Heavy. Awkward. Then Tom looked up with something between pain and awe in his expression. "They tried to erase you, and you became president." Traore gave a faint, tired smile. "That's the part they can't control." Tom stood, his hand shaking just slightly. The letter, the footage, the tape, it all made sense now. And none of it was fiction. "I'm going to tell this story," Tom said. "Not in a movie. Not on a stage. I'm going to make sure the world hears what they tried to bury." Traore looked at him. "Quietly," he said. "Then don't tell my story. Tell his." Tom froze. "Sloane's?" "No," Traore said. "Yours." He gestured to the notebook in Tom's hand. "You weren't trained by a soldier. You were trained by a man trying to undo his sins. Your story is about what you do now, not what he did then." Tom didn't speak, but his eyes said everything. Tom walked outside into the night air. The sky was wide open above him, darker than any Hollywood set could ever fake, deeper than any spotlight could ever reach. He clutched the notebook tightly, as if it were the last real thing he had left. Traore stepped out behind him, arms folded, eyes fixed on the horizon. They didn't speak at first, but the silence wasn't heavy now. It felt clean, like something had finally broken loose from both of them. "You're not going to be the same after this," Traore said quietly. Tom didn't turn around. "I hope not." After a long pause, Traore added, "The world will think this was just another celebrity visit. Some vague humanitarian gesture. They'll say you came to shake hands and post a photo." Tom turned toward him now. No smile, no posing, just truth. "I don't care what they think. I came here because something in me was unfinished. Sloan saw it. You saw it. Now, I see it." He looked at the notebook in his hands. "And I can't go back to pretending." Traore nodded. "Then don't." He reached out, placing a firm hand on Tom's shoulder. "Go home, burn the script, forget the movie deals. Tell the truth, whatever it costs." Tom looked at him. "And you? What will you do?" Traore's answer came without hesitation. "Keep doing what they tried to kill me for living." The next morning, Tom boarded the same jet he had arrived in. No press, no headlines. No one even knew he had left. But inside his duffel bag was the notebook, and in his pocket, the dog tag. He didn't sleep on the flight. He stared out the window for hours, watching the clouds shift like ghosts. When the plane touched down in Los Angeles, his assistant rushed up the stairs with a clipboard, rattling off meetings, deadlines, and premiere schedules. Tom held up a hand. "No press. No interviews. Cancel everything." The assistant blinked. "But the studio," I said. "Cancel everything." He walked straight to his home office, locked the door, opened the notebook, and began typing. Not a script, not a memoir, but a confession. A story the world wasn't ready for but needed to hear. He titled it with just 4 words. He was 17 once. Weeks later, an anonymous article appeared online. It detailed a U.S. military operation in Mali that never officially happened. It described a young African boy marked for elimination who would later become a president. And it exposed a covert program known as Opal, along with damning quotes from a once beloved actor, now disillusioned and angry at what he helped normalize through screens. The world didn't know who wrote it, but they felt it. And somewhere, far across the ocean, Traore read it and smiled, because sometimes truth doesn't need a name. It just needs someone brave enough to tell it. If this story moved something in you, if it made you question the difference between what's real and what's just performed, then don't scroll past it. Like this video, leave a comment, and subscribe for stories they never meant for you to hear. The world writes heroes into scripts, but the real ones never ask for a spotlight. They survive in silence and hope someone's listening.